Okay. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Welcoming you both our live audience here on the terrace, and I'm looking up here at our video camera, our Zoom audience as well. Welcome to the library's terrace. We are making an effort here to do some hybrid style programming. I'm sure many of you have seen, maybe attended some of our virtual programs or some of our other outdoor events, concerts and events like that down at the band shell. So this is our way of trying to combine the two into a new style of event. My name is Jeff Zay. I'm the Adult Programming Coordinator for the Port Washington Library. And while weather and I think hopefully a nice sunset perhaps is in store for us, we're attempting, as I said, to try out this new type of hybrid programming and keeping our fingers crossed all our technology cooperates with us. And just double checking, everybody can hear me even in the back there? Great. And everything's looking good on Zoom there, Bob? Okay, terrific. How many are on Zoom? I'm not sure. Okay, great. So all aboard, here we go. I'm very glad you've chosen to spend some of your evening with us for this special program with author and local Port Washington resident Elon Green, who will be discussing his new book, Last Call, A True Story of Love, Lust, and Murder in Queer New York. But before I introduce Elon and our moderator tonight, fellow author Sarah Weinman, I want to let you know that following tonight's discussion, we'll have time for Q&A, both from our in-person attendees as well as those in our virtual audience. Those of you on Zoom, you can type any questions you may have in the chat, and we'll make sure we read through those at the end. I also want to thank our wonderful friends of the library for their generous support for tonight's program. You may have seen on your way in tonight that signed copies of Elon Green's book are on sale, nicely discounted, thanks to the friends of the library. And they will continue to be on sale for the rest of the week. That way those who are attending the program virtually or were not able to attend the event will have an opportunity to purchase the signed copy as well. So I just want to give you a little background about our author and moderator. Elon Green has written for the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, The New Yorker, and the Columbia Journalism Review. He has been a writer and the editor of long form since 2011. He also contributed to the true crime anthology Unspeakable Acts, which was edited by our moderator tonight, Sarah Weinman. Ms. Weinman is the author of The Real Lolita, A Lost Girl, An Unthinkable Crime, and a Scandalous Masterpiece, which was named the best book of 2018 by NPR, BuzzFeed, The National Post, Literary Hub, the San Francisco Chronicle, and Vulture, and won the Arthur Ellis Award for Excellence in Crime Writing. She has edited a number of other crime and suspense anthologies, and she writes the twice-monthly crime column for the New York Times Book Review, and her newest book, Scoundrel, is due out in February of next year. So, suffice it to say, you two are both well-versed in the world of true crime writing. But I know that your new book, Last Call, is more than a gripping true crime story, and that is also about telling a story that has not been told before, and showing us the lives of those in the gay community in the early 1990s who had to live in the shadows and hide their true selves from the rest of the world. And I'm glad that tonight's program gives us an opportunity to shed some light on the histories and lives of many people whose stories have not been told before. So as I hand things off to you both, I want to thank you for being here and having this discussion with us. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Elon Green and Sarah Weinman.
Thank you all so much for coming to this in-person event, which I'm getting used to this again. I think it's my first in-person event since February of 2020. For Elon, I know that you just did one, but how does it feel to be back doing this in front of live audiences?
I mean, it's a novelty. It's pretty great.
It's good to just sort of take it all in. So, again, thank you so much for coming. Elon, I think the best way to kind of open this conversation is you had written a number of features, some in the crime realm, some not, and those did not ultimately become books. So how did you know that this topic, that this case, that these men, that this was the substance of a book project? And at what point did you realize, oh yeah, I want to spend like several years on this as opposed to some other project?
Well, I think, and I don't know how it works for you, but every story idea kind of sort of starts off as a feature, and then you find that at a certain point maybe it gets too big to be a feature, and then it sort of just has to be a book by default. And that had never happened to me before. And also I have a short attention span for these things, and so I tend to get bored by the time I'm finished. And that wasn't happening with this. And the point when I realized it was a book was reading the court transcript, and I was reading the testimony of a sanitation worker, and he was just talking about his day, and it was really banal, and we made a left turn onto 72 and a right turn onto 70, and then we went through a state park and so on. But for whatever reason, it was so detailed and so gripping that I thought, if the sanitation worker's testimony is this good and this vivid, I mean, everything else must be even more so. And it was.
So, walk me and us through, I guess, the nature of the research and the reporting that you did on the victims, on the men who were murdered by the last killer, because it was so important, and it really came through, that you really wanted to illuminate their lives and not just sort of glorify their deaths or anything like that. So I wonder, going in, what choices did you have to make in terms of what you wanted to know and what you wanted the reader to know and what you maybe didn't want them to know?
Well, I'll take the first part of that first, which was that I went about it any way I could to get details of their lives. I mean, they had been dead for 30 years, and none of them were well known in their lifetimes, so they were fairly poorly documented. But it meant just talking to everybody, and the first place that I went to find sources was high school yearbooks and college yearbooks, which luckily, if you go back far enough, they're pretty easily accessible. Strangely enough, the more recent a yearbook has come out, the harder it is to get.
Why do you think that is?
Privacy issues. So I would talk to people who had gone to high school or college with the victims, and I would find newsletters from the schools that would talk about, so-and-so getting a promotion, and, all these different places where you could sort of get a sense of their life and career arc. And then I also reached out to friends and family members directly. The detectives on the case were also surprisingly good sources on, for biographical details also, as was the trial transcript. I mean, there was a good deal about the lives of the men in the trial transcript as well. And as far as what I chose to include or exclude, I didn't think that the audience deserved to know everything, and I only put information in if I felt it really illuminated their lives in a important way, or if it was pertinent to the investigation. But there was a fair amount of stuff that I found out about these men that I just felt was nobody's business.
Obviously, each one, there's sort of a varying degree that you were able to find out and then convey in Last Call. And what sort of challenges were there, especially I think it was Anthony Marrero that you had the toughest time finding much of anything about?
So Anthony Marrero was the third victim, early 1993, and he's the biggest failure in the book, not in the sense that he is a failure, but that I failed. I got almost no information about him beyond what had already been published in the New York Times. had been discussed at trial. The only document I was able to find separate from that was in the death index, the New Jersey death index. And even that information is suspect because I took the information that I found to a private investigator who agreed to do some work for me for nothing. And he ran the information on the Social Security, the Social Security number. And it turned out to be a woman who was still alive living in D.C. So I don't know how much of the information about him, even that I think I know, is actually true.
And so as a result, like Michael Sakara and Peter Anderson, I think in particular, you were able to really get a sense of them as people who live really full, complicated lives. And so my question related to that is, like, you were able to talk to family members, and how forthcoming and willing were they to talk with you, and was that always the case at all times?
If they were willing to talk to me, they tended to be forthcoming. Otherwise, they were pretty adamantly unwilling to talk to me. But that was the minority. I had one very contentious conversation with Peter Anderson's son, who said, I know you're going to do the book if you want to, but I don't want you to do the book. And, he was upset. He felt that I was, reopening old wounds, which was true. But I thought that people were surprisingly willing to talk to me.
Surprising because it was like reopening wounds?
Yeah. I mean, because although, I had this big picture idea, and I had this idea of placing the victims into, a larger picture and the generation that they were a part of. But, that's my view from the outside. From the view of the family, in the most simple terms, Dad cheated on Mom, and then he was murdered. And that's an entirely valid point of view also. So I can understand their unease.
As can I. One other thing that's important to talk about with Last Call is that it's not just an investigation of serial murder, but you're contrasting this or putting it against the backdrop of much larger issues, especially with the advent of AIDS in the 80s, and one other thing in particular, like the activism that erupted because of this pandemic that happened that was essentially ignored by the government and willingly and actively ignored. So there's a lot of material that I know didn't make it into the book, but how deeply did you have to delve into all the activism and all of the sort of the milieu and the world in which these men were living in and what was happening around them?
Very. I have a chapter on an organization called the Anti-Violence Project, which was founded in 1980, and it was a group that arose out of Chelsea, and it arose because Chelsea residents were upset that the police didn't care when they were assaulted or killed, and then the legal system also did not care. And so they were founded to make people take this seriously. And the organization still exists, but for reasons I still don't understand, they refused to talk to me for the book. And the version of their history that they tell, for one reason or another, is incredibly incomplete at best and wrong at worst. Even to the point of misidentifying the first executive director. And so I was putting their history together from scratch, based on a lot of primary interviews, stories in the New York Native, unpublished oral histories. And, I kept telling them, I will give you all these tapes. your history is wrong, and I'm trying to correct it. And they did not care.
If you had to speculate, why didn't they care?
Well, first they cited privacy issues, and then I pointed out that they'd already set the precedent of opening their files for David France. I think they thought I was just an irritant, and maybe they thought the book was never going to happen, and I don't know.
I take it you haven't heard from anyone from the official anti-violence project people since Last Call came out.
They've never acknowledged the book, which I think is a little weird because their history doesn't exist anywhere else. And the group just, last year celebrated their 40th anniversary. I don't get it.
One other sort of micro-history that really figures into Last Call is the way that you write about the gay bar scene. So I wanted to sort of hear more about that, and specifically the townhouse, because I feel like you really also developed a personal relationship with that place.
So New York City, and Manhattan in particular, in the early 90s had, just the most raucous, exciting gay bar scene probably in the country. I mean, there were 70 or 80 bars in Manhattan alone, and they catered to all sorts of different attractions. And they were all, mostly in the Village, Chelsea, some of them in the East 50s. And even though this was on the cusp of Sex and the City, and even though Manhattan is probably the most, widely chronicled piece of real estate on the East Coast, the gay bar scene was almost completely ignored by journalists. Even mostly the Village Voice. And I couldn't, when I started the project, I sort of took it for granted that, by the time I get around to having to write about the bars, there'll be a lot of source material, and there wasn't. Outside of, a couple of the queer publications, nothing had been published, in any real length about the bars and the clubs. And my theory is that that's because when historians look at that period, it's purely through the prism of AIDS. And so they don't really care about the bars and the clubs. And
it's like they're only concerned with tragedy, and they're not concerned with...
They don't really acknowledge that, despite what was going on, people still wanted to have a good time, and they did. And, generally when people do acknowledge that, it's only to be, kind of a moralist, and they'll bring up the bathhouses. But that's it. Nobody talks about, well, they, went to the Five Oaks after work and listened to Marie Blake. So I was very lucky to find that there had been a bar rag called HX, and what it was a pamphlet and later a magazine that was published every week, and it was left in the bars, and it was just a extremely well-written calendar of events telling you what would be going on for the next week at any given bar and club in the city. And the founder and editor of the magazine is now a real estate agent living in the Bronx, and he gave me his collection of the publication. And that provided me with an invaluable look at what was going on any given week.
But you were also, many of these bars have, of course, shut down, but not all of them. That's why I brought up the townhouse.
Yeah. And I tried to go to ones, that still exist where I could. Marie's Crisis is still there. It's been around for, God, like half a...
Never die.
Yeah, it's been around forever. The Duplex, I think, is still there. Five Oaks went out of business in the late 90s. But the townhouse, I spent a great deal of time there, even when I wasn't reporting, because I really liked talking to Rick, who was the piano player who factors pretty prominently into the book. And I tried to go to the other places when I could, like Julius, which is it's considered to be the oldest gay bar in the city. I think it goes back to the 30s, something like that.
So you had brought up earlier, in terms of research and reporting, that you had a number of police sources. And I was thinking about this in terms of, I guess, what I would charitably call a multi-jurisdictional investigation. But I wanted to kind of hear more about that, because I think what we have been learning over the past few years is that, well, you know, the obvious thing is that policing has major problems, but also that they just don't solve cases very well. And so I wondered, like, how did you balance the fact that you needed police sources and they were forthcoming with the fact that you were ultimately going to be very pointed, I think is a good way of putting it, in terms of describing the ways in which the investigation of the murders wasn't always up to par?
Well, I mean, I was lucky in that most of my police sources had already testified at the trial, so they knew the ways in which the investigation had failed. However, the bigger picture for them was that it was still a win because the case got solved. So they didn't have any hesitation in talking to me because, you know, the bigger picture was positive. And, you know, ultimately the, you know, rabbit holes they went down and the wrong turns they took made for an interesting story. And they knew that. Very few of them ever made excuses for themselves. They seemed perfectly happy to acknowledge, you know, bad choices, and to a surprising degree, actually. I mean, I guess part of it is that it was already, you know, documented somewhat, so there was no point in making up stories. I could
They couldn't contradict the record.
I could just get it elsewhere, and also when mistakes were made, sometimes they were made in very entertaining fashions, and because it was multi-jurisdictional, the jurisdictions were happy to tell me about mistakes that the other jurisdictions made. So, you know, the biggest example in the book, you know, I had been talking to New Jersey detectives for some months, state police and some other jurisdictions in the state, and I was probably talking to like 6 or 7 of these guys, rotating through them to get stories. And finally one of them says, "Has anybody talked to you about the Giuliani thing?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, I'll give you some of it, but you'll have to get the rest from the other guys." And he proceeds to tell me this story about how, sort of in a roundabout way, Rudy Giuliani had, you know, screwed up the investigation. And not only Giuliani, but the NYPD in particular. And so then I started asking everybody else, you know, for more details and more details. And, you know, the NYPD comes off looking pretty bad in the book. And of course, I didn't get that story from them. And in fact, when I did finally get the man who was at the time police commissioner, Bernard Carrick, who later became infamous for having a love nest in, where was it? Was it downtown or?
Oh, with Judith Regan or whatever?
Yeah. And, you know, he told me that it didn't happen, and then he called me back a couple of weeks later and told me off the record that it did happen, and
which leads to probably the best footnote in the book.
Yeah, I mean, when I had written my original draft that I had filed to the publisher had straight up called him a liar, and the lawyer who vetted the book said I couldn't do that because Bernard Kerik is still alive. And so he basically came up with some legal language to imply that Kerik was a liar, and that's what's in the footnote.
So we have gone this entire conversation until now without bringing up the Last Call killer.
I always forget about him.
But that's my question, which is like, he's pretty forgettable, but also so many, so much of the publicity, not just in terms of your book, but also ancillary coverage and other media, always fixates on the killer. And so I wanted to know how you were able to kind of sidestep a lot of what I think of as the true crime pitfalls, especially in depicting him or not depicting him.
Well, first of all, in a way, it was easy because he denies that, to this day, he denies that he did it. And so, I think one of the reasons that murderers and serial killers in particular, get the spotlight is because they talk about what they've done. And, which is undeniably compelling. But since this guy didn't, it was sort of easy to ignore him. And, but I, did the work to find out about him, and I talked to college classmates and high school classmates and grad school and one of his cousins, but in the original proposal for the book, there wasn't even a chapter on him. And then I got kind of jammed up by the structure of the book, so I had to write about him. But I never really developed much of an interest in him beyond, him being like a plot device.
And he's never been in touch with you directly?
No, but he has kind of mocked the book, even though he hasn't read it, in a letter to an old acquaintance, and has sort of casually threatened to sue me, which I told his friend to write back and encourage him to do so.
That's how you know you're being noticed. So one last question before I throw it open to questions from the audience, which is that a few months before Last Call was published, you wrote an essay called The Pernicious Whiteness of True Crime. And so looking back, it's been about a year since that came out?
Yeah, it feels like a decade.
Is true crime less white now?
No. No, I don't think so. You'd know better than I would. I don't really read it, so you tell me.
So, that's the flippant way of asking, have you noticed any concrete or interesting changes in the year that you've written that essay, or do you have any more specific things that you've noticed that are better versus whatever? So not better.
I think people are thinking about it more than they did a year ago, and people keep citing the essay, so I think those ideas are percolating a bit, and I think people are open to discussing it. But whether that's trickled down to the industry level and acquiring editors and such, I have my doubts.
Television and podcasts.
Yeah, I don't know. I think if there's a difference, it's probably on the margins. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm more optimistic than you are, but I think that whatever change is going to come, we won't see for maybe at least 2 or 3 or 4 years down the line, just because it takes so damn long to get any project off the ground, be it a book or a podcast or a film or documentary or scripted series, or sometimes they're all linked and they're all the same concept.
Frequently they're the same concept.
Which is a whole other discussion for another time, but I guess the question is more, how does this genre keep evolving in the way, like, what would you want to see more of or less of?
If I had a choice, I'd want every single work of true crime to deal with systemic issues. and not just tell us the ins and outs of the murders and the investigation and the trial and that sort of thing. I mean, that's, some of it you have to have, but, I frequently get criticized for not having a chapter about the trial. It's just one of those tropes of the genre that I don't care about. Trials are only interesting if something unique happens, or at least they're only interesting to me. And if not, then why spend 3,000 words on a trial?
And that wasn't the story that you set out to tell. So if it had been, then it would have been useful. But since it wasn't.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is that from the perspective of getting people to change their behavior in the genre, it's that especially murder trials are uniquely compelling because the prosecutor has an incentive to get witnesses to tell the most exciting version of a story, and it also in a very linear fashion, and that becomes the spine of any story. And that's a very attractive thing to work with, and it's very
like my next book starts out with a murder trial.
Yeah, and so it's very hard to shake that, and I suspect most people just don't think it's worth the effort.
Once again, it seems like the answer, which is my stock answer, is it depends.
Yeah, that's about the best you can say.
So with that, let's open it up to audience questions, and we're also going to take questions from the Zoom chat, which I think will be relayed by Jeff. But let's start with an in-person question.
Yeah, so, yep.
Elon, after the book came out, did you hear from anybody who had interesting information who either you didn't know who that person was, or who wouldn't talk to you the first time around?
Not anybody who wouldn't talk to me, but there were plenty of people who heard about the book or read the book that wrote to me, and knew people involved, and I would talk more about that, except that it's the subject of an essay that's going to be published with the paperback next year.
Is there another question here in the audience? Yeah. And then for anybody who's watching on Zoom, feel free to type your questions there in the chat. We can read those out as well. Yes, Steve?
Hi, Elon. Terrific book.
Thank you.
Do you feel, now that you said you're new to the true crime genre, do you feel pressure to do another book in that genre, or is the publisher pushing for that?
The publisher and our shared agent are sort of surprisingly low pressure. Readers, I think, want another one. But other than that, not really. I mean, I think the book also kind of makes clear where my interest is in the genre, and it's mostly about the people and the stories, and less so about the cases themselves. So I would sort of be the wrong person to pressure.
Do we have any other questions there in the chat? Okay. You guys were just discussing the whiteness of true crime. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. Is that something that's a newer analysis of the genre? Is it one that is some genre now, or something that's being addressed in terms of new work that's being done?
Well, the essay that I wrote was for a criminal justice site, and it arose out of probably years of back and forth between Sarah and I and our friends who are also in the space, because because it's it's been sort of a frustration for us for years, and finally I just said, I'm tired of this. I'd like to know how this happened, and so that's where the piece came from. But I would say that it's not a very broad conversation that's happening. It's still very, very small.
Yeah, I mean, there's a trope of sort of the beautiful dead white girl, and in popular culture, it always existed, but I think it really got cemented with Twin Peaks and Who Killed Laura Palmer, and that was already 30 some odd years ago. And certainly with true crime programming on television, be it Dateline or now Investigation Discovery, there's the stories that are privileged generally tend to be missing white girls and women. And so in privileging those stories, what other stories are not being told? And not just stories and people, but also, as Elon pointed out, what larger systemic issues are not being folded into because they make the story that you want to tell a lot more messy or a lot more complicated, so it doesn't fit with a 44-minute, hour-long program kind of thing. And so in books, the idea too is that if book publishing is predominantly made up of white people, then how are they going to properly publish or market or publicize stories that don't fit the paradigm that they're already part of? So, I mean, it's like the larger thing of everything, but in true crime, because it's about murder and death and violation and trauma and assault, I think it becomes there's an extra incentive to kind of redress and correct and try to make the balance a little bit different.
Yeah, I mean, and there's also the larger issue of the American public tends to care about whatever journalists and news anchors and newspapers tell them to care about. I always come back to this Gallup survey from, I don't know if it was 2015 or 14, that people said their greatest concern was Ebola. And that was purely because it had gotten a lot of press coverage. Should it have been a concern for basically anybody in the U.S.? No. But people are very susceptible to suggestion and media coverage. And so when you're talking about whose stories get privileged, that has a whole host of downstream effects. Especially even at the legislative level. In California, the example I always go back to is that California used to be a state that was extremely progressive on the rights of felons and, work release, and I don't know, you might remember more about this than I do, but it was in the 70s.
Also, being able to grant or that incarcerated people could be up for parole in a very short time.
Yeah. And
there was a huge backlash in the 80s because it was the 80s.
I mean, but, part of the reason that there was a backlash is because of Sharon Tate. And Sharon Tate's mother took it upon herself to start basically the victims' rights movement. Right. Which is kind of preposterous, that it shouldn't have any part in the criminal justice system, but that cemented in people's minds that the legal system was not being harsh enough on people. And so it took away all of these really interesting progressive ideas that were part of the criminal justice system at the time, and I think that the country is worse for it.
There's so many television programs that are whose subject is crime, SVU, all the spin-offs, FBI, NCIS. What do you think it is that draws, and they're very popular, what do you think it is that draws the public to these kinds of stories and to your kind of story?
Because they're both exciting and they're low stakes. They're not real, so it's sort of, they're very easy to watch. You know, there's no larger, there's no larger stakes. I mean, they're just good stories. And, you know, they're resolved at the end of every episode. And, you know, the criminal gets, the gavel comes down and the criminal gets to jail. You know, there was a tweet years ago that I think about all the time, and it was, you know, the writer had said something like, you know, the reason that SVU is so popular is it's basically this fantasy that the NYPD will care when we're raped and, you know, justice will be done. And, you know, when it comes down to it, that's exactly right.
I mean, there's so many people I know who watch either current Law and Order episodes or especially reruns, almost like it's comfort food, that they just have it on in the background and it helps them go to sleep. And I get it, because there's a rhythm, like there's an order. Like each episode follows a particular template and they don't deviate from that template, and there's order at the end, and suspects are apprehended, and there's justice. And it's a television show, or it's a movie. And even with television depictions of true crime, again, it's like there's an order because the program ends. So it means that because it's put into the entertainment mill, the audience is not necessarily grappling with the real ramifications, which is also, I think, why, I don't know if this happened to you, especially after our last call, but I know after I wrote and published The Real Lolita, I actually got more sensitized to crime stories instead of getting desensitized.
I had already been very sensitized to it. My feeling is that if I had gotten through the research and writing of Last Call when I was looking at, you know, crime scene photos and dismembered bodies, and if I was still sensitized to that at the end, then that's probably just my natural state.
Okay. Oh, one more question.
So, having done kind of a deep dive into it, who do you think was doing the best contemporary reporting on New York gay life and culture since, say, Stonewall?
The Native. I mean, I don't know if they had any competition. The New York Native was a gay paper. I don't know how long it was around, but, you know, some of the best work on the early days of the AIDS epidemic are in the Native. I mean, it's very much a first draft of history in the best sense. The Native was great. Village Voice, so-so. And then, The Advocate. Back then, the Advocate was also very good.
Is The Advocate how you first heard of this?
Yes, that's right. And when I first heard about it, it was a story from 1994. The Advocate was very good. And then there were some excellent newspapers out in San Francisco, but the pool of well-read queer publications was small. And I mean, sort of nobody else really took gay life seriously. In fact, it was generally to the contrary. The most well-regarded New York Times editor, Abe Rosenthal, hated gay people and mocked AIDS, and basically had to be forced into covering it all. On his headstone, it is said something that is sort of widely considered to be a jab at queer people. It says he kept the paper straight. So, that's what people were dealing with at the height of the AIDS epidemic.
Okay, I think we have one question on Zoom. Excuse me.
You talked about the difficulty of doing research with more recent yearbooks, for example. Are the narrative journalists of the future going to lack the materials to tell these kind of stories as well because of the lack of paper-based materials, for example?
I would think so. But I think it also entirely depends on whether or not the case in question is solved. If the case is solved and there is a trial, then there will be an extensive record of the case and of sources and timelines. But barring that, I don't think the coverage of cases is nearly as extensive as it was, and it will be much harder. I think it would have been much harder to write about the last call case even a decade later.
Yes and no, just because there are, so many people are documenting their lives in real time on social media, but so much of that is ephemeral that it could disappear on the internet. So, and I also want to back up.
Which is why I kind of discount it.
Fair enough, except if people are living their lives online and then someone ends up dead, you can sort of track where people were at any given point. But what I wanted to back up is that it's also just a lot easier to report on a solved case than on an unsolved case, which is something we both have done, you successfully, me so far not so successfully, because when a case is unsolved, you're in a vacuum because the police officially can't tell you anything because it's an open investigation, even if they might not necessarily be actively working it, or they might be trying, it kind of evade the journalist's questions. And so my own...
And you also don't get access to any kind of, official documents. And even when a case is solved, it's still hard to get that stuff.
Sometimes you have to sue or file lots of freedom of information requests, but yes.
Okay, any more questions for Bob? Okay. Dan? There's one in the back. And then I think we're starting to lose our daylight here, but happy to have one more question.
Do you have to wrap that? Or I don't know. I was just wondering, do you, you present the story of being of its time and place. I'm wondering if you that things are so different now in gay life in general, would not play out in the same way today, and what ways have things changed that would affect what would have happened, and what ways do you feel they haven't changed?
I think in this particular case, things would have played out differently because there would have been external pressures that weren't there, and also, but more importantly, law enforcement would have had to take them seriously. But that's because 3 of the 4 victims were white. These sorts of cases now, if the victim is not white or if the victim is trans, you're still not going to get a fair shake from the criminal justice system, the legal system, law enforcement. So somebody's always getting screwed. It just changes depending on the decade.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you both very, very much for being here, for having this terrific discussion. Congratulations on your book and on your upcoming book, Sarah. I want to thank our friends at the library for their terrific support for this program. And before we do wrap it up, I just want to remind everyone that signed books are available inside, nicely discounted by the friends of the library. I encourage you to visit their table inside there. And as I mentioned, we will have the book on sale here at the library for the rest of this week to give others an opportunity to come and purchase a book. And again, just want to thank you guys again. I appreciate the intent. Yeah, go ahead. Let's hear some applause.
Thank you.
But again, I just want to make a special note that writing and telling the stories of those that have not been heard is, I think, a noble cause, and I think it's something I appreciate about your new book. So, do you guys have any last words?
Bye, Elon.
That's a good one. Yes. All right. Well, thank you both. Thanks everybody for being here. Thank you, The Weather, for cooperating, and thanks for coming to our hybrid event tonight. I hope to see you at other events. Thanks very much, everybody.
Wonderful. It worked out so well.
Yeah. Thank you.